Thank you so much, Paula. Greetings to all of you. I have a short presentation which I'll take you through, but before I do that, as the first slide is shown, I wanted to express my deepest appreciation to the Cabinet Office of the Government of Japan, as well as to UNDP and UNDRR for organizing this forum. As we've heard, just in the last 25 days, we had a devastating typhoon in the Philippines, southern part of the Philippines, and we had the disaster in Tonga just in the last few days. So clearly this forum, the discussions are very timely. In the first slide, the outline, I will cover two topics that the organizers can flip to. The first slide, outline of presentation. I'll cover the evolving approach, ADB's approach and disaster resilience, and how our policy has been shifting towards resilience. And second, I'll focus on financing with particular reference to Southeast Asia, the region kind of closer to where we are right now. Well, we have a global audience, but in terms of looking at the countries that we cover in Southeast Asia. In the next slide, please, under ADB's holistic approach to resilience, the four blocks that you see, ecological resilience, physical resilience, financial and social and institutional resilience. These four areas have always been present in ADB's work with the developing member countries, but they've been emphasized in different ways. So what we have done, particularly in the last 2 years, is to embed them into our revised policy framework, which you will see. Next slide, please. Which also shows how we have shifted our overall policy framework to boost resilience. The first item here is the revision to the ADB's disaster and emergency assistance policy, which actually is a 2004 framework, which our board approved. The update was approved last year in 2021. In fact, as we were going through the pandemic, this revised framework provides for strengthening our focus on resilience, as well as helping countries to improve the management of residual risk. The four principles in terms of focusing on the principle that risk management begins with risk reduction, mainstreaming resilience and disaster risk management considerations, making them part of the development process instead of just being on a reactive manner, and helping countries to countries with differentiated risk profiles to create opportunities for enhanced resilience, as well as focusing in a very clear manner, starting with relief, recovery, and to go into reconstruction interventions. Next slide, please. The second thing that has been done again in the last year is to revise our emergency assistance lending policy. Next slide, please. Which the key changes there focus on project preparation, provision of reconstruction assistance. And it also includes early recovery activities such as rehabilitating critical infrastructure, which would also be key to meeting basic needs that are identified through damage and needs assessment or loss assessment. And the last items you see on the screen is to establish a second window under our Asia Pacific Disaster Response Facility. We have recognized through years of supporting our countries that a lot of countries, particularly at disaster times, need a lot of support, technical assistance support in the early days in the aftermath of disasters. And this is what particularly this expanded window does. Next slide, please. I'll now go into providing you with some illustrative examples of ADB's assistance. A caveat that I wanted to make here is that finance is obviously very, very critical when countries are looking at post-disaster assistance or post-pandemic assistance, as we've seen. But here, in terms of particularly disaster risk management, we as an institution actually have to improve ourselves in terms of counting the assistance that we provide. We do a large number of projects. Just to give you an idea, over the last 5 years alone, 575 loans, grants, technical assistance projects have DRM features, but not all of them are classified from a financing point of view as providing support. But in terms of direct assistance, we provided $3 billion. But the figure that you see is Southeast Asia. Over the last 30 years, we provided upwards of $10 billion of assistance. For natural disasters, It amounts to $1.7 billion in loans and a large $400 million grant that was provided. Professor Takea spoke about the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami that hit the Aceh province in Indonesia, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013, as well as the more recent Palu earthquake and tsunami in 2018 in Indonesia. Now, all these assistance packages are focused very clearly on Build Back Better principles. Of course, in 2004, we did not have it, but clearly at the request of the then Minister of Planning, who is now the current Minister of Finance, Minister Sri Mulyani, we had focused on how can infrastructure principles, quality infrastructure principles, which also emerged later, could be incorporated at that time, and also focusing on inclusion and addressing disaster risks through greater resilience. Next slide, please. On contingent disaster financing, this is a new instrument that has been introduced by ADB in April 2020. In fact, as we were entering into the COVID-19 pandemic, what we've done is the CDF was expanded to include pandemic response. Natural disasters have always been there, including pandemic response mechanisms through disbursement triggers. What we did was, as two immediate projects, one in the Philippines for 500 million and one for Indonesia for 500 million, with combination of pandemic as well as disaster triggers. Now, the advantage of this modality, it's a dual purpose. It provides for rapid liquidity support, but also at the same time enables policy reforms, deeper policy reforms in the countries that we operate in. And finally, the last slide, if you go to the next slide, please. Pandemic, obviously, needless to say, has been devastating in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia. And we have provided over $5.4 billion of support through what we call as a COVID-19 active response and expenditure support program. Significant assistance has been provided for vaccines because clearly everyone needs to be vaccinated for us to address the impact of the pandemic. Last slide, sorry, I'll take just less than a minute. Now, in the context of building back better, focusing on climate change is very, very critical. So at COP26 in November in Glasgow, we launched an ASEAN Green Recovery Platform in addition to support for energy transition through an ETM, or Energy Transition Mechanism. This, as you see on the screen, it's called also 10x, 10 times leveraging resources that we have from Green Climate Fund, the UK, the EU, as well as Italy. This would be focusing on accelerating the region's recovery from COVID-19. Thanks so much, Paula. Sorry for running a little bit over time. Thank you.
No problem at all. And thank you very much, Ramesh, for this overview. Really, your presentation has allowed to focus on one of the most important elements related to recovery financing and overall disaster resilience financing. Let me ask you an immediate follow-up questions to your presentation. You highlighted the ADB principle of risk management begins with risk reduction. Can you tell us what action you would suggest to be taken by other institutions to build back better approach and increase risk reduction attention? Basically, what were the steps within ADB that ensured the development and systematic implementation of this important principle? You're muted.
Sorry. Couple of examples come based on our recent experience. I'll take institutions kind of broadly defined. It's national institutions as well as international institutions. Assistance for capacity building is very, very critical. Now, I mentioned that our recent policy shift is to mainstream risk management, including addressing residual risks as part of the development process. This calls for clearly a more proactive approach. And such an approach clearly is not feasible in all line agencies and all line ministries. So the policy reform assistance that we've been providing, as well as technical assistance, in fact, helps in achieving just that. In Indonesia, both in Indonesia and Philippines, the policy measures that we have supported provides for such a system to be in place, Paula.